We're back in the city of Pergamum. Ancient city of Pergamum is 40 miles away from Izmir, which is the Smyrna was located in the 7 churches of the book of Revelation. Last year, I was here around this time, and I was learning a lot about Pergamum and the importance of what idolatry and worship was in the ancient world. But right behind me, over to my right, we have what is called the Great Altar, the altar of Zeus. Now today we don't have a remnant of what the altar looked like. Today you can find it in Germany, in Berlin, Germany. You can find what it looked like back when they discovered it. The biggest altar in the Asia Minor. And here you can see, where they worship the god Zeus. What they will do, they will come do sacrifices, and then they will take it down to the bottom of the city there, in the bottom of the hill, and they used to sell the meat sacrificed to idols. And that's what you see in the Bible in regards to, in the book of Acts, talking about meat sacrificed to idols, and also what you have, idolatry and fornication. Ritual fertilities, and the way everything was worshipped here. You can see how the influence of idolatry had a lot to do with the everyday life of every believer that lived here in the time in the first century. When you understand what John was conveying in the church, in the 7 churches, then it's easy to know why Pergamum was one of those places. Pergamum was at one point the capital of all of Asia Minor. It was part of the Macedonian great kingdom, and then it was ceded to the Romans somewhere around the late part of the 1st century BC. Now, with that being said, understand that this was a very important city for commerce. It was one of the cities of the Neokoros, temple warden, which we will talk about pretty soon when we get to the top of the hill. But right now I want to focus mainly on the altar of Zeus. The book of Revelation talks about this in chapter 2. You need to consider and understand the context and the cultural understanding that John is dealing with. Here was a very important city. It was actually where they have scrolls, and the Bible talks about the scrolls in the book of Revelation. Pergamum, Pergaminos in Spanish. So you see the scrolls actually is a very strong feature of how they came from this location and this place. Pergamum at one point was one of the most important cities within their kingdom. And we can see is a pivotal role in what it is idolatry in the ancient world. So here is what you would have seen, the great altar of Satan, which deals with the worship of Zeus in the 1st century. As I study the Bible and I travel to these places, one of the things that really made me realize the importance of knowing how difficult it must have been for the believer in the 1st century. One of the accusations, and I like to read the verse, but in the book of Revelation chapter 2, it talks about the church in Pergamum. When you read the verse, you really don't get a sense of how difficult it would have been for them in the 1st century. You don't really get an idea how they live, so you don't really connect with them spiritually or physically or mentally to their struggles and their faith. As we're coming up in the, and we feel the wind coming up as we're coming up in the, in the lift, and we start noticing the high elevation and the beautiful scenery and how high place this was, it's no surprise there were so many temples here. The God of the Bible is the God of mountains. In the ancient Near East, you have temples in high places. And it's easy to see why that was done. It has a lot to do with their belief system, as in Greece. They have the temple of Athena on a mountaintop in the middle of the valley. So we see it here. But what really piques my interest is the way that I was trying to correct the letter in Pergamum, to the Pergamum. And it's saying this. It says in verse 14, "But I have a few things against you, that you have those there who hold fast to the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block upon the sons of Israel, to eat food sacrificed to idols, and to commit sexual immorality." Now, when you read that, you can make a lot of assumptions about what that meant. But it's not until you come here till you get an idea of the importance of understanding the culture, the geography, and the way they lived. For example, as we see the temple of Zeus that I showed you earlier, understanding how they did things here. They will sacrifice meats to those gods, Demeter, Athena, Zeus, to the emperor, Trajan, and to the other emperors in the imperial cult. Then what would they do with that meat? They will sell it in the market. So it's telling you that Israel was living, and the Jews were living in the midst of paganism. just like it happened in the time of the Bible in Canaan and in Egypt, and also all over the diaspora where they lived. And sometimes, and I get an idea what that feels like, because I'm in this beautiful country, but yet I don't eat the meat. I don't eat halal meat. So I understand in a small way how they felt every day, meaning that they could not eat any of the meat that was here, because it was against the Torah and also the instructions in Acts 15 against those very same things. In the Bible, the history of the Bible is about holiness, kedusha, how to live according to the holiness of God. How do you do that? Moral behavior, idolatry and fornication, immorality. That's why in the Bible, adultery and idolatry are so linked together, to let us know that you're not to worship any other gods or anything that comes along with the worship of other gods. In the time of Pergamum, it included fertility rituals and included also meat sacrifice to those gods. Why? Because of what a theme that we're going to talk about for the rest of our trip here in Pergamum: honor and shame, patron and client relationship. Once you understand those two themes, how they live in the first century, it's a lot easier for us to see why it was so difficult for them to live here and not partake of the things that occurred in this city like Pergamum. Now remember, Balaam gave the advice to Balak as to how to make Israel stumble. Israel can only fall from within when they become part of the society by applying syncretism within their worship. Not to worship like the nations, not to eat like the nations, and not to practice the immorality as the nations. On the positive side, we have to consider the strength, the faith, and the honor behavior that the people that believe in Yeshua in the first century, and also in the God of Israel, how they lived their lives not behaving the way this all city would have behaved. To walk differently, to eat differently, and to worship God in loyal love, and not to mix themselves with the gods that would have been practically impossible for them not to look at every day, walking in every single road that you see within this city. So for that, we want to give thanks to those believers who actually conquered, those faithful ones, and let us be just like them. No matter how much influence we have in this world, let us be loyal and faithful to God, not to do the very things that God told Israel all the way in the time of the Egypt, gone into the land of Canaan, also live in the diaspora and the dispersion, and the same struggles and testings that they lived here in Pergamum, as well as the 7 churches. Remember not to do the same thing today in South America, in Europe, and in America. One of the things that you really get to appreciate in some of the first century type cities is theaters. Within the theater, like in this one in particular, which is adjacent to the temple of Asclepius, you see a capacity of 3,500 people. It was actually donated by a benefactor. Benefaction was an integral part of everyday life in first century. It were people who were well elitist, people who had money, who had resources, and they gave to the community. And one of them, a noble person, he donated for this to be built. In turn, he will get praise. Someone will be always grateful for what he did. And therefore, benefaction was a very important concept that you and I must understand when we read the New Testament. The ultimate benefactor is our Messiah Yeshua, that through him we have received life. As we receive life everlasting by the gift of God. When you come to the Asia Minor and you see all the theaters, they all have one thing in common. You have the upper stories for the poorer people, and then you have the elite. They sit in marble chairs. And this is one of example, just like in Greece and just like in Rome. You have different status in the caste system of Rome. And this is one example of how they treated people with status and people who were elite in the first century. Benefaction, remember, being a benefactor in the first century was very important to everybody. And if you were a benefactor, you donated to improve the city, to improve your life, to improve your community. In exchange, the people gave them thanks. And they always gave them praise for the benefaction to the city. And this is an example of how this particular person was a benefactor to this particular city here in Pergamum to help improve the life of the people worshiping here in the temple of Asclepius.